This is my analysis of The Sound of Trees by Robert Frost. This poem describes trees rustling in the wind and how annoying and distracting this noise is from productivity. The narrator imagines they are talking about leaving their paralyzed lives, but the trees are indecisive and never actually end up leaving. The narrator is tempted to keep listening to them, but he decides he will do what they never do. He'll leave his responsibilities behind and make the reckless choice. So this is a poem like many of Robert Frost's, which uses a metaphor of a natural phenomenon to explore an aspect of human life. The subject of this one is missed opportunities. The poem compares people who quietly make changes with people who complain and procrastinate, but never actually make changes. The trees represent those moaners. The roots represent responsibility holding us back. And Frost criticizes these people who lack ambition, represented by the trees, and who prefer to carry on with their mundane lives instead of taking risks. The poem focuses on these people, but it also gives a small mention of those who do make changes, and they are represented by the clouds. And of course, clouds are free and up above the trees, so they're a really effective metaphor for how Frost is showing that the reckless way of living, as he puts it, is superior to staying in your comfort zone. So we're going to get more into this metaphorical meaning later on, but first of all, let's go through the poem line by line in detail. I wonder about the trees. Why do we wish to bear forever the noise of these, more than another noise, so close to our dwelling place? The first line of the poem, as is usual in Frost poetry, establishes the subject matter of the poem really clearly, so that would be trees, and also its tone, which is a thoughtful and evaluative one. A really striking thing here is in the second line, the word wish, which is a very positive word, being really close to the word bear, which is a very negative one. So these really contradict each other. And I think bear is especially striking, not just because it's after this positive word, but also because we would ordinarily think of the noise of trees as a nice thing, something peaceful and calming. But this is intentional of Frost, I think. And the reason I think this is because it's really emphasized by the enjambment, which places it at the end of the line, and the stress that comes with this. So I think this is to make the point that we wish to hear the noise of the trees. They are comforting and maybe even addictive in a way, but it is not good for us to do so, and it's ultimately doing us a disservice. So this comes back to what the trees are actually saying within the metaphor, and again, we'll get into that a bit more later. Forever is also a noticeable word because it shows us how deeply the narrator is enamored by the trees' noise. And another thing to notice is that the sound of the trees is described as noise, not something more positive like music. And this gives the impression that it's boring and meaningless. The trees have made the same sound so often that all it is noise now. We suffer them by the day, till we lose all measure of pace and fixity in our joys, and acquire a listening air. Suffer is again a strongly negative word, and fixity means like fixedness, so being organized and planned and things. And I know that's probably obvious to everyone except me, but when I first read the poem, I didn't know what that meant, so I just thought I would mention that. And these lines are basically saying that listening to the trees makes us unproductive, not only in terms of work, but also in terms of joy. Like, we neglect things that make us happy as well because we're sort of addicted to the sound and all we want to do is listen to the trees. And listening air is probably a pun on listening ear, and I think this is just sort of a reference to the natural theme of the poem, so how the wind is blowing through the trees. They are that talks of going, but never gets away, and that talks no less for knowing, as it grows wiser and older, that now it means to stay. So this is the first time that the trees are personified, and this is done through the words talks and growing wiser. And they are shown to be indecisive because they talk of going and then they decide to stay. The circular nature of these lines, brought about by the rhyme of away and stay, gives the impression that what is happening is sort of like a circle as well. So in other words, the trees go back and forth on this matter all the time, and they just keep doing the same thing, like going round a circle. My feet tug at the floor, and my head sways to my shoulder sometimes when I watch trees sway from the window or the door. This describes how the narrator almost becomes like a tree when he's watching them. His feet are like roots and his head sways like the crown of branches. And the way these body parts are described almost like they're their own entity suggests that they're out of the narrator's control. So he appears to be mesmerized or in some kind of trance through watching the trees. So we get the sense that they are very persuasive and their message is very consuming. I shall set forth for somewhere. I shall make the reckless choice. Some day when they are in voice and tossing so as to scare the white clouds over them on. I shall have less to say, but I shall be gone. These lines are really, really interesting because we get the impression that the narrator is going to leave behind his responsibilities, but also the impression that he won't have the guts to do that. And it's sort of up to the reader to decide whether he will or not. So in lines 19 and 20, he seems to be breaking out of the tree's influence. However, he is still quite like them, because he says he'll go, but he is postponing it just like they do. He'll go someday. Therefore, he's sort of a hypocrite. I think that he will go though, or at least I like to think that he will, from the final lines, because the narrator says that he will not be around to tell people of his adventures because he'll actually be on them, which I think is a really great message. Also, the repetition of I shall from his initial declaration and then in the final lines emphasize his determination. So that makes me think that he is going to be more determined and more proactive than the trees are. But yeah, we're not sure if he will stick by his word or whether he'll go back like the trees. It's left for the reader to decide, and also I think for us to make the decision in our own lives. Another thing I want to point out in these lines is the clouds. So I think the clouds represent the movers on, and the trees try to scare them into staying within the status quo, but they don't have anything logical to reason with, only fear. So the white clouds might be scared also because making changes and breaking norms is an intimidating thing to do. So I think that Frost got across the complexity of this situation, like making changes and breaking the norm in a very complex way, because it's not a simple thing. You can't just say, oh right, I'm going to take risks. There is drawbacks to it and there is fear involved, and I think he got that across really well. Now we're going to move on to the form of the poem. So the metaphors of trees and clouds as respectively crowd followers and risk takers is really, really effective in my opinion, because trees are loud whereas clouds are silent, and trees are tied down whereas clouds are always moving and changing. There's also personification of the trees through talking and growing wiser and older, which emphasizes how they represent a certain type of person. Then there's negative words, or words with unpleasant connotations, such as noise, suffer, and bear. And these are really striking because they display the trees as annoying, when generally their sounds are seen as calming. It's also striking, of course, because Frost is normally very complimentary when describing nature. The rhyme when describing what the trees are saying of stay and away creates a circular rhythm, representing how the trees are always repeating this same pattern of thought. Then there's the swaying motion, which is both described in how trees sway and portrayed in the general rhythm of the poem. And that is a metaphor for how people, represented by the trees, go towards opportunity but then come back over and over again. Listening air is a pun on listening ear, and that brings more elements of nature into play to get us immersed. And finally, there's repetition of I shall in the final lines to emphasize the narrator's determination. Now let's have a brief look at the tone of the poem. So it's quite exasperated and frustrated, and this is shown through the repetition, the rhetorical questions, the strongly negative words, and the enjambment, which could give the impression of ranting. But the narrator is also mesmerized by the things he's annoyed at and exasperated at. And I think this is really cool because the narrator is not an omniscient onlooker. He too is affected by the influence of the trees. And this is shown through his wonder at them, how he will only leave when they are in voice, and how he finds that he mimics the trees while he's watching them. And this, I think, gives more weight to the message of the poem and makes it a bit more interactive because we, like the narrator, have to figure out where we stand on what the trees are saying. Are we just going to follow their influence, or are we going to break free and do what they can never do? That brings me to the overall meaning of the poem. And I think that Frost is making the point with this poem that humans have a choice in how we live our lives, even though we may feel like we don't. We feel like we're too tied down by responsibility. And the trees are an effective metaphor for this because they don't seem to have a choice either, being rooted to the ground. But Frost hints that they do, or at least that they would if they changed their attitude. Thus, though this seems a scathing poem about trees, it is really focusing on human nature and also highlighting the hidden power of the natural world at the same time, which Robert Frost loves to do. So, on first sight, you may think that the conflict is between the go-getters, the clouds and the narrator, and the apathetic moaners, the trees, of the world. But by having the narrator ambiguously drawn between these two, we're not sure whose side he will join. We see that the tree's perspective is not so simple. They, like everyone else, are fighting a battle between duty and imagination, and they just happen to be the people who side with duty. And this is shown through their roots holding them down and how they continuously say they're going to go, but they always come back. The message then seems to be that we should stop being so mesmerized by voices that are telling us to obediently shoulder our duties and fulfill our responsibilities, and instead make the reckless choice and be free like clouds. However, there may be even more layers beneath this. What if the man's hesitation is there to show us that choosing our imagination and our dreams isn't always the right decision? He will follow his dreams, but only when the time is right. This whole poem is set against the backdrop of Frost's home in rural New England, where duty is everything. And if people just did whatever they wanted to do, the farming would not be productive, and people wouldn't have anything to live off. Therefore, Frost may be advocating a balance between duty and imagination, or he's simply presenting both sides of the debate and letting us weigh them up for ourselves. This theme of following our dreams or shouldering our responsibilities is also explored in his poems Birches and Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening.